Walkabout, James Vance Marshall. Chapter 12. All night the bustard baked in the ashes, and by morning it was tender as broiled lamb. The children ate it hungrily. Peter and Mary wanted to linger over the meal, would have liked to pick every succulent scrap off the bustard's bones, but the bush boy was impatient to be off. Morning mist was still changing the sides of the rift valley when he smothered out of the ashes the fire, beckoned to the others, and moved off along the fault. He set a fast pace. Mary, not knowing the cause of his hurry, wished he'd be more considerate for Peter's sake. But in spite of her misgivings, Peter's vitality, at least in the early morning, seemed to be limitless, quite capable of measuring up to the bush boy's long, loping stride. Indeed, he apparently had energy to spare, for he hopped around the bush boy like an exuberant puppy, his shrill, questioning voice echoing back from the rocks. And strangely enough, the aboriginal seemed to be understanding and answering his questions. Peter had decided to learn the black boy's language. It would be far more useful than the French his sister was always boasting about. He trotted up to the aboriginal, holding a fragment of rock. "Say, darky, what do you call this?" "Garsha," the boy spoke with grating harshness, hard as the flint itself. "And this?" The white boy plucked at a tussock of grass. "Karthara." The word was whispered lithely and like the rustle of a wind through a sea of grain. "Garsha, Karatha, Garsha, Karatha, Karathara." Peter's reedy tremble echoed down the valley. He went rushing on ahead. Presently he came trotting back and handed the bush boy a lump of quartz. Hour after hour the questioning went on. Mary felt very much alone. For lunch they ate yams, queer-looking bushman drakes that grew in disheveled heaps beneath an outcrop of rock. Once again they rested through the midday heat. At least Mary rested. The boys chattered like gossiping kookaburras. Then they were walking again, heading southwest across the red sandstone plateau. The plateau was not a pleasant place for walking. It shimmered with heat. The children's footsteps kicked up a cloud of fine red dust, and there was no water. Soon even the ebullient Peter was reduced to a sober plod. Dust hung for a long time in the motionless air, so that looking back the children could see behind them a whizzing haze of redness stretching far across the plain. After a while, Peter started to sneeze. The dust was tickling his nose. At the first sneeze, the bush boy grinned, remembering their original meeting. But when the sneezing continued, becoming louder as the dust inflamed Peter's nostrils, the bush boy looked at him anxiously. He hoped the little one hadn't caught the fever that comes with the rains. Peter, in fact, was starting nothing worse than a common cold, the type that is almost chronic among people who fly long distances and experience sudden changes in temperature, and this cold was now being aggravated by the plateau dust. He sneezed and sneezed and sneezed. He went red in the face. His eyes poured water. The bush boy regarded him with astonishment. Aboriginals know all about fever, but they never have colds, and they seldom sneeze. Certainly the black boy had never witnessed such prolonged and noisy paroxysms as Peter's. All that afternoon and half the evening the little boy sneezed his way across the dusty plain. He only stopped when they came to the edge of the plateau, and the soft red stone gave way to granite, smooth and hard, not to be kicked up by shuffling feet. But by the time they stopped for night, Peter was utterly exhausted, too tired to help the bush boy with the fire-making, too done in to eat. He crawled wearily across to his sister, put his head on her lap, and fell instantly asleep. The bush boy banked down the fire. He was pleased with the progress. That day they had covered 17 miles. If they kept this pace, another 7 sleeps would seem to them to the valley of waters under the earth. Once they got there, the strangers would be safe. He didn't go near the lubra, knowing that for some reason his nearness alarmed her, perhaps because he was ignorant enough to think that the spirit of death might pass in juxtaposition from him to her. Instead, he lay quietly on the opposite side of the fire. He was just drifting into the dream time when, quite unexpectedly, he sneezed. Morning mist refracted the rays of the sun, tumbling them into the valley like a river of molten gold. Bathed in sudden light, the children stirred. The bush boy was first to wake. He woke completely and instantly, every bit of him together. 1 second lost in the world, the next completely alert. He rose, flexed his muscles, sniffed the air, and walked quietly down valley. Peter woke next. He sat up, yawning, rubbing eyes and nose. He'd have liked to blow his nose, really. It felt all bunged up. But having no handkerchief, he sniffed loudly. His sister rolled on her side and looked at him critically. "Peter," her voice was disapproving. "Where's your hanky?" "Lost." He didn't wait for recriminations, but got up quickly. "I'm going to look for the darky. Coming?" She shook her head and lay down again. He wondered why she looked suddenly hurt, as though he'd slapped her across the face. He wandered off, hands in pockets, sniffing loudly. Instinctively, he headed down the valley, down the broad granite cleft that ran like an axe cut from plateau rim to fringe of the plain. He had been too tired the night before to take notice of their campsite. It had simply a place to go sleep in, but now the scenery's bizarre grandeur caught his imagination. It was, he decided, just like the moon, just like those rocky, fierce-colored lunar landscapes of the cosmic, half expecting some Martian monster to come leaping out. Indeed, from the far side of the jagged outcrop of granite, he could, now that he listened carefully, hear something that sounded rather like a Martian feeding. A sort of scrunching mingled with heavy breathing noise. Fear fought curiosity and lost. Cautiously, he squirmed his way up the wall of rocks and peered over the edge. 20 feet below him was a small pool, rock-ringed, crystal clear and motionless as glass, and beside it was the bush boy, trundling a small boulder of quartz about the size of a football but 10 times its weight. He saw Peter and grinned. "Yarawa," he pointed to the pool. Peter glissaded down. He saw the Yarawa at once. Fish, silver-scaled, glistening, darting, ranging in size from 3 to 15 inches on their sides of a row of small black dots like portholes of a liner. He suddenly remembered that he had no breakfast. "Ymira?" He pointed at the fish. The bush boy nodded. The pool was shallow at one end, and Peter waded in. He could see the fish quite clearly. There were thousands of them, well, hundreds anyhow. But whenever his hand snaked down to clutch them, they darted away like quicksilver. The bush boy laughed. He beckoned Peter out of the pool and led him to a smooth, circular rock smaller than his, but quite as heavy, he suspected, as the little one could lift. "Kokura," he said, and started to trundle his boulder of quartz up to the shelving ledge of rock that overhung the pool. Peter followed him, and soon the boys and their stones were poised on the edge of the rock that jutted out like a diving board over the water. The bush boy mimed his intention. Peter nodded in understanding, and together they hoisted up their boulders, staggered with them to the lip of the rock, and hurled them into the pool. The splash was cataclysmic, loud as a whip crack, echoing round in the encircling rock. The spray was torrential, like a collapsing of miniature water spout, and the concussion in the confined rock-bound pool was overwhelming, like an explosion of a depth charge. The fish were stunned. Upside down, they came floating to the surface. The bush boy leapt into the pool. Peter followed. Together they grabbed at the paralyzed fish, tossing them out of the water on the rocks. Within 60 seconds, a couple dozen Yarara were squirming their lives out on the smooth, sun-hot granite. The bush boy was jubilant. Climbing out of the pool, he gathered the fish together in a twisting, glistening heap, playing with them, trickling them through his fingers like a miser worshipping his gold. There were so many fish, they were so slippery, that when the boys wanted to take them back to the campsite, they couldn't carry them. Not until Peter took off his shorts. Then in these they wrapped the Yarra up and carried them in triumph. When the children had eaten 3 fish apiece, Peter refused to put on his shorts. There was quite a scene. Feel them, the little boy said. They're horrid and scaly, full of fish. Wash them and put them on, his sister ordered. Shan't. Peter eyed her defiantly. It was the bush boy who settled the argument. He was ready to move again. The Yarawa were too valuable to be left behind. He rolled them in the little one's shorts and tossed the bundle to the lubra. Kokura, he said. And so began the 4th day of the walkabout. The going was easier than on the plateau, down the lower reaches of the valley, then out across the plain, the vast, lonely, and limitless plain that rolled on, a flowering wilderness, silent as sleep, motionless as death. Over the level ground, the bush boy moved quickly, too quickly for Peter, whose cold made him short of breath. Soon, the little boy was panting. After a couple of hours, his nose started to stream. The midday halt in the shade of a group of the golden casuarinas was never more welcome, but it only lasted a couple of hours. Then they were walking again, across the endless plain, on and on. Halfway through the afternoon, as they were crossing a monotonous belt of scrub, they came a diversion as welcome as it was unexpected. The children were walking in their usual order, the bush boy first, Peter next, Mary in the rear, when suddenly the bush boy stopped dead, like a pointer, 1 foot off the ground, nose forward, an arm flung behind him for balance. For perhaps half a minute he stayed motionless, frozen. Then he crept quietly forward to where a low bank of wattle bush formed a screen of scarlet around the tiny clearing. Expectantly, the others joined him. Together they peered through the wattle leaves. They saw a bird, an ordinary, rather sad-looking bird with big eyes, pointed beak, and long, straggling tail. He was scratching about for grubs. To the white children, the scene looked very prosaic, an anticlimax, but the black boy was obviously enthralled. He signaled to them to be quiet, and so they knelt close up to the wattle bushes, motionless, expectant. And after about 10 minutes, their patience was rewarded. Quite suddenly, the bird raised his head. He drew himself erect, and with a stiff leg, goose up, strutted into the center of the clearing. Then he started to sing, and in an instant, all his drabness was slothed away, for his song was beautiful beyond compare. Stream after stream of limpid, melodious notes, flowing and mingling, trilling and soaring. Bush music, magic as the pipes of Pan. On and on it went, wave after wave of perfect harmony that held the children spellbound. At last the notes sank into the croon, died into silence. The song was over, but not the performance, for now a metamorphosis too amazing to be believed. The drab brown bird, with its tatty, strangling tail, disappeared. In its place rose a creature of pure beauty. The drooping tail fanned wide, its 2 outmost feathers swung erect to form the frame of a perfect lyre, and in between spread a mist of elfin plumage, a phantasmagory of blue and silver shot with gold that trembled and quivered with all the beauty of a rainbow seen through running water. Then, hidden behind his plumage, the lyrebirds again burst into song, and as he sang, he danced, prancing joyfully from side to side, hopping and skipping to the beat of a high-speed polka. And every now and then his song broke off, interspersed with croaking chuckles of happiness. Then, as suddenly as his performance had begun, it ended. The feathers drooped, the polka came to a halt, the singing died, and he was just another bird, scratching the earth for food. The children walked on. The sun dropped lower. The western sky glowed rose and gold. At the first breath of sunset wind, they made a camp beside the group of eucalyptus. There was no water, but the fish alleviated their thirst. Out of the dusk came ants, winged ants, flying in swarms, attracted by the glow of the fire. Mating in midair, they shed their wings, dropping intertwined to the earth. The bush boy stirred up the flames to move them. Coils of wood smoke streamed downwind. Peter moved farther from the fire, for the smoke brought tears to his eyes, brought on another attack of sneezing. But his sneezes were neither as prolonged nor as violent as they'd been the night before. His cold was on the mend. Though they'd again walk close to 15 miles, he felt reasonably fresh enough at any rate to appreciate the miming. For now, out of the shadows of the firelight strutted the bush boy. His hands were 3 leafy branchlets. These he draped about his body to represent wings and tail. Then he started to dance, to mimic the polkaing lyrebird. Round and round the fire he strutted, pantomimed, and pranced. Then he screwed up his mouth and burst into a shrill, raucous singing. His absurdities grew more tempestuous, more abandoned, yet never lost their realism. At first the white children were simply amused. Then, as the pantomime grew even livelier, even more grotesque, their amusement turned to unrestrained delight. They laughed and laughed till the leaves fell from the humble bushes. They stamped their feet and clapped their hands till the floor of the desert seemed to shake, and sparks from the from the fire went whirling away like fairy lanterns into the night. Then suddenly and unexpectedly, in the middle of his dance, the bush boy sneezed. He sneezed again and again. He never sneezed before. Abruptly, the pantomiming came to an end. The sneezing had a curious effect on the bush boy. He seemed to grow suddenly weak. He passed a hand over his forehead, and his fingers came away damp. When he saw the dampness, a great fear came over him. He remembered an old man he'd seen in the tribal caves, an old man who had sneezed at the time of the rains, whose forehead had become damp with fever, whose body had been very light when they lifted it to its burial platform. He began to tremble. Slowly, uncertainly, he walked across to the fire. He lay close beside it, close to its warmth, but he couldn't stop shivering. The white children looked at the bush boy in astonishment, but neither went to him. The boy, because in the last few days he'd witnessed so many incomprehensible changes of mood, he'd come to disregard them. The girl, for reasons of her own. Soon both brother and sister slept. But the bush boy didn't sleep, not for many hours. He lay close to the warmth of the fire, and he couldn't stop trembling, and quite frequently he sneezed.